Good afternoon and welcome to the Rutgers-Newark Small Business Development Center After Lunch webinar. Today's webinar is Cybersecurity for Small Businesses. I'm just going to take a few minutes of your time before we get started to talk a little bit about the SBDC if you're not familiar with us. We are a resource center for the Small Business Administration. And our objective is to provide business consulting and advisory services to individuals who either want to start a business, or if you're established, you need help in different areas of your business to grow, whether that will be help with financing, government procurement, cybersecurity, marketing. The SBDCs have counselors with expertise in different areas that can help you at no cost to you. We are grant funded, paid for by your tax dollars. All you need to do is contact us either by phone or through our website and request counseling with us, one-on-one counseling with us. And once we assigned you a counselor, they'll follow up with you and help you through whatever issue you might be facing with your business. Our office here in Newark, our jurisdiction is Essex County. So there is 12 centers across New Jersey, and each center is responsible for one or more counties. If you are outside of Essex County, feel free to find your local SBDC by visiting www.njsbdc.com. We also provide many training, workshops, and webinars, such as the one that you're tuned in today. And it doesn't matter where in the state you live, you are free to attend those training events. Some of these workshops, you are entitled to post-training counseling if you attend. Some have fees and some don't. But once you attend, you are entitled to post-training counseling. It doesn't matter what county you're in, but after the issue has been taken care of, we transfer you back to your respective counties. For the purpose of today's webinar, we have muted it because we have 57 people signed up for today's webinar. So that's quite a lot for us to enable sound for everyone if you need to ask a question. So please feel free to use the chat box. There's a Q&A section and we don't use that much. Just stick to the chat and we'll answer any questions that you have at the end of the presentation. If anyone here at the end of today's presentation wants more assistance in regards to cybersecurity, just feel free to reach out to us. The contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Michelle.
Priscilla, thank you so much. And thank you to the SBDC. Folks, if you didn't get the message already, let me reiterate. These are free resources. Free is a good thing, particularly when you're a small business owner. And in fact, for those of you that like to read ahead, if you want to peek at slides 41 and 42, you will see a list of other free resources, all of which are specific to cybersecurity and data protection, and again, geared towards small business owners, solopreneurs, if you will. And this way you can get further information, further resources at no cost to you and your business, including training information for your personnel, including staying on top of what's going on in the state of New Jersey, and also who to contact if you have the God forbid. So with that said, I should warn you that my first part of this presentation is to actually go off script. So I'm not going to jump into the slide deck yet, because what I want to talk to you all about, which is one of the reasons why I'm sure You are all very happy to be at a webinar today and not sitting in a room with 50 some odd people, and that is coronavirus. And how are you dealing with you and your work staff, no matter how large that staff is, in terms of its ability to work remotely, if in fact that's necessary? Part of that is business continuity, but part of that also needs to take into consideration cybersecurity and data protection. So if your intent is to have your personnel work remotely, if you don't already have a secure VPN, now would be a really good time to look into licensing one. And I will tell you, one of my clients, who is a small accounting practice, 4 people, had a VPN. It was not well secured. In November, one of his employees had logged in using the same computer that his 9-year-old son was gaming on. Unbeknownst to the employee, all sorts of bad guys had gotten into their home computer, because gaming sites are ripe for such things, and was already lurking around the employee who was working remotely, seeing where he was going and what he was doing. Now, fast forward to early tax season, and now we're into February, and my client was working at 11 o'clock at night on returns, and all of a sudden, one of the returns that he was working on e-filed. He didn't press the button. He didn't launch it into the system. It appeared to file on its own, which, needless to say, he thought was a little bit odd. Waited till the next morning, contacted his IT guy, because of course everybody has an IT guy. And the IT guy said, well, let me reach out to the software vendor. The software vendor said, oh, it must have been a glitch. Don't worry about it. And if you have any doubt, you might want to tell the particular client whose return was e-filed to do a paper filing, what have you. Didn't think anything about it. 2 weeks later, same thing happens. A return e-files on its own. Now, our accounting client is getting a little bit concerned, reaches out to his guy again. The guy again reaches out to the software vendor and says, must be something wrong with your systems, don't know what's wrong. I finally got a call from the client on Good Friday, and the only reason I remember it was Good Friday because my hand was in the middle of a turkey as I was getting ready for family. And he said, hi, I got your name from one of my friends. I think I've been breached. Remember that I started this story with this happened back in November at one of his employees' home computers. And because they had an insecure VPN, and because they had insecure practices on the office systems, somebody was lurking on his systems for 5 months undetected. And even when it was finally detected, he didn't realize it was a breach until a month after that. And as you can imagine, an accountant's systems is a treasure trove of data. You're talking about social security numbers, you're talking accounts, you name it, it was in there. You cannot take this stuff lightly. And particularly now where indeed you may be having staff working remotely. And again, I apologize, this is not in the slide deck. So please take the time to take some notes here. Double check your VPN if you haven't already. Also ask your employees who may be working remotely that if they haven't already changed the preset password on their home routers, they should change those, because they come with default passwords, which anybody could find online. So unless you change that default password, for all you know, somebody's already on your home system. The other thing that you should be telling your employees, if they haven't recently changed their passwords and credentials to access work environment, to think about changing them in the near future. They should not be using the same passwords or credentials for getting into work that they're using for other accounts, whether that's social media, whether that's online banking, or anything else. What they use as credentials to get into work environment should be unique to the work environment. So please, 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 especially now where you may indeed have employees working remotely, have these things top of mind. If you haven't already prepared, if you haven't already tested your systems, do so. And in that regard, think about this also. How many licenses do you have for your VPN system? If you've got more than, say, 20 employees and you've only purchased 10 licenses, it may not be in your budget right now to purchase an additional 10 licenses. So then the question is, do you want to consider rotating your staff and saying, okay, you staff members are going to work remotely from 9 a.m. until noon, log off, work on paper, however you want to use the rest of your time, and have the second set of your staff then log in from noon until 5 o'clock. I'm not suggesting these are the right time frames. I'm just saying think creatively to the extent that you do plan on having staff work remotely anytime in the near future, whether it's because of coronavirus or for any other reason. You want to make sure that where you have these systems in place, you're using them securely and your employees are using them securely. So with that public service announcement, let's now jump into the slide deck. Now, of course, because I'm an attorney, nothing would be complete without having a public service announcement saying that I am not your attorney. This is, in fact, not your legal advice. However, I hope that you will take to heart from a legal standpoint what the current state of the law is and what the law is becoming in the state of New Jersey. I will tell you right now, and again, just going off of quote unquote script here a little bit, that the state of New Jersey is currently contemplating a cyber law. It is still in the works, but don't assume it's not going to happen in the near future. Now, for those of you who have not seen this quote before, it's actually been attributed to several different folks and not just Mike Rogers. And there's different flavors of this quote and this expression, but the short answer is it's for real. There are two kinds of companies, those that have been hacked and those that don't know it yet. You need to be aware of what's going on in your systems. And as we go through today's discussion, again, think about my small accounting practice. 4 people full-time, 4 people seasonal. They didn't know for 5 months what was going on in their system. In terms of how long it may take to detect what's going on in your system, if you're very lucky, you will discover it within 24 hours. And in fact, one of my larger accounting practices did in fact discover it within 24 hours. However, and again, no presentation like this will be complete without war stories. The way that this larger accounting practice found out they had been compromised is as follows. They had all the right things in place. They did all the right trainings. People knew what they should and should not do. During tax season, one of the managing directors got an email from another accountant with a multinational firm saying, you might find this article interesting. Rather than verifying who the email was from or what the link was, the managing director clicked on the link. He had that lovely, oh my goodness moment, fill in the blank of your favorite expletive, but did not say anything to their internal IT guy. He just said, I clicked on the wrong thing and hopefully it's not going to come back to bite me. 24 hours later, he got called by one of his high net worth clients saying, what did you send to me that is now corrupting my iPhone? So they were lucky in the sense that they found out within 24 hours, but needless to say, that's not a good client relationship that the way you found out is from one of your clients who you've now compromised or caused to be compromised because you were a trusted resource for that client. To me, one of the scariest statistics is the one that you'll see here with regard to Dominion National, which had a compromise in its system which went on for nearly 9 years. Now, I will tell you that is the exception to the rule, but more often than not, you're lucky if you're going to detect and be able to react to something that's going on in your systems if you have not prepared for at least 6 months and sometimes as long as 1.5 years. So please, 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 as we go through these slides, be proactive, not reactive. You don't want to be one of my statistics. In terms of what the risks are, and by the way, to the extent that any of you are already involved in this arena, whether it's cybersecurity, data protection, privacy, you'll hear people talk about vulnerabilities and you'll talk about risks. They're not synonymous. And the idea is this: you may have certain vulnerabilities that you identify in your systems. However, what the risk is to your business will depend upon what business you're in, what type of data you have, what the exposure is. But don't assume there is not exposure, and the risks are real and they can have real impact on your business. The risk could be reputational, they could be regulatory fines, you could have disruption of operations, loss of funds, internal morale, you could face litigation. Now, we're going to get into this a little further in the slides, but I will hearken back to the huge Target breach from many years ago, or it seems like many years ago now. And if you recall, it happened right around the holiday seasons. I will tell you that I thought twice about walking into a Target store after that breach was announced. The scary part is when you think about a company like Equifax, with whom we have all entrusted significant amount of data. Their reputation was severely impacted by that breach. And I will tell you that several months after the breach became public, I certainly didn't get the warm and fuzzies when the acting CEO testifying before Congress answered, "Are your systems protected now?" And he said, "I don't know." None of us had confidence in Equifax, certainly then. I will tell you the reputation is slightly restored by the recent announcement that in fact they've confirmed that that breach was caused by foreign nationals. But the fact is, there was a weakness in their system. They were in the midst of patching that weakness. They had a fight with the vendor who was undertaking the patch, and they didn't replace the vendor to complete the patching. That's a real impact on the company's reputation. As far as regulatory, there are fines now that are being assessed both on the proactive side and the reactive side. And you'll hear me use those phrases throughout this discussion, proactive and reactive. Reactive is where you've had a breach and you are found to have been negligent or didn't give timely notice or various other things that could give rise to a regulatory fine following a data breach. You can also now in certain jurisdictions, including New York and California, be fined for failing to be proactive, for failing to put into place reasonable measures to protect the data that you are collecting. Operationally, if you've got people who are supposed to be doing their normal jobs and instead they're helping to respond to a data breach, by definition, your productivity is going to be going down. Financially, needless to say, not only are we talking about the regulatory fines, but I go back to my example with Target. Your sales may go down, your revenues may drop. And if you're a small grocer, unfortunately, as much as your customers may love you, if you've had a credit card compromise and you now have to tell your customers, "I'm really sorry, but your data was exposed because my systems were compromised," they may be going to ShopRite or King's rather than to your small grocery store the next week, not because they don't still like you as a person, but they want to make sure that their information is secure, and you may see your revenues go down. As far as internal morale is concerned, if you've had a major compromise, are your employees focusing on their work, or are they dusting off their resumes because they don't think you're going to be in business next year? And as far as litigation, you folks have seen the headlines as much as I have. They're not pretty, and the last thing you want to do is be on the cover of the Star Ledger or the Wall Street Journal. If you're still asking why you should prepare, depending upon what type of business you're in, you could be subject to state laws. And as I mentioned, in New Jersey right now, the only, and I say only, the only piece of state law that's in effect is a breach notification law, which requires businesses in the state of New Jersey, if in fact they are breached, and keep in mind with regard to state and other regulatory frameworks, we're talking about a compromise of personally identifiable information or protected health information. Depending upon the jurisdiction, those definitions may vary a little bit. New Jersey recently amended its breach notification law to add to what is personally identifiable information, biometric data. That's a new addition to the New Jersey law that wasn't part of what was considered personally identifiable information in the context of a breach previously. So if your business has a thumbprint time clock, you want to ask, how secure is that time clock? How securely am I protecting my employees' thumbprints? If you're not being proactive and making sure that those systems are secure, and then those systems are compromised, you're absolutely going to have a notification obligation, not only to state law enforcement officials, but also to your personnel, and those notices need to be given in a timely manner. The breach notification laws come with fines for failure to give notice in a timely fashion. I will also tell you, for some of you businesses that may have consumers in California, that if you're subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act, that statute now gives a private cause of action, meaning that if I'm a customer of yours and my data is breached because you failed to protect it proactively, I can sue you. That is the first state law that allows for a private cause of action. Interestingly enough, Washington State is trying to adopt a breach notification amendment that would in fact allow for a private cause of action as well. Right now, I will tell you that the Washington State House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives in Washington State are fighting over whether in fact there should be a private cause of action. So to the extent that you have any customers out in Washington State, keep that in mind. New Jersey statute, as I alluded to earlier, is still pending as to what they're going to do in terms of a proactive piece of legislation. But if I were a betting person, my guess is that statute will finally come to pass later this year. If you have customers currently in the state of New York, you are subject to the New York SHIELD Act. And by the way, SHIELD is an acronym, and I apologize, I never remember the acronym. It's the Stop Hacks, and I'm not going to get the full acronym for you correctly. I actually have written an article about that, and I'm more than happy to share that with you if you email me after today. We've also written an article about the California Consumer Privacy Act. And in part, you may be scratching your heads and saying, why do I care about the law in New York? Or why do I care about the law in California? Or for that matter, various other laws that may not apply to my business. And for you folks that are small business owners here in the state of New Jersey, you may be scratching your heads and saying, yeah, do I really care? Well, if you have customers that are subject to those statutes and you're managing data for those customers, you need to care. Because even if you are not bound by one of these state or federal pieces of legislation, you may have obligations contractually. And if you have obligations upstream to your customers, you should think about what your contracts downstream are saying. What are you requiring your vendors to do? And when you think about vendors, don't think about just your IT guy. Don't think about just your cloud provider. Think about the cleaning crew. And some of you may be sitting in your offices scratching your head and saying, why do I care about the cleaning crew? Well, the reason you care about your cleaning crew is if they're allowed to come into your offices and clean at night after the place is a ghost town, and you don't have a clean desk policy, and you've left on your desk sensitive information, whether it contains personally identifiable information or whether it contains client confidential information, the cleaning crew can take a picture of what's on your desk, use it for their own purposes, or share it with third parties. So again, think about what your obligations are contractually upstream and think about what your obligations are contractually downstream. The other thing to be very careful of is what you say on your website. Assuming that any of you are on the web already, and my guess is, if not all of you, most of you probably are, be very careful what you say in your privacy policy. I'm actually working on a privacy policy for one of my clients currently, and they said, well, we can say that we absolutely keep your data secure, right? And I'm not misquoting. That was the question that was put to me yesterday. And my answer was in all capital letters, no. After I apologized for quote unquote yelling to my client online, I explained you cannot guarantee anybody's privacy today. Even if you act reasonably, even if you act appropriately, you digest this webinar, you put into place appropriate measures, stuff is still going to happen. And if your website says we guarantee your privacy under the FTC Act, that is a deceptive and misleading trade practice for which you can be held accountable. So again, another one of your takeaways from today's discussion is to go look at your own website, print out your privacy policy, and see what it says. If you are making any type of definitive statement that we protect your information, we have in place measures to ensure your privacy, that language needs to change. What you can say is something to the effect of intended to protect, designed to protect, but you can't guarantee it. That's very important. You don't need to be cited for an FTC violation. And by the way, in addition to having federal legislation in that regard, there's also New Jersey state laws in that regard, that if you are giving out misinformation on your websites as to what your privacy practices are, you will be cited for that if somebody is paying attention. So then the question is, what are you preparing for? I never like to use the B word, the breach word, if I don't have to. So whenever my clients call me up and say, oh my God, Michelle, I've been breached, my first answer is, please breathe. Let me know if you need oxygen, but you need to breathe. You need to stay calm. And now let's discuss whether you've had an incident or whether you've had a data breach. The distinction is critical in terms of breach notification obligations. If you have quote unquote merely had an incident where somebody has knocked on the proverbial electronic door but has not gotten access to personally identifiable information or protected health information or other sensitive information, then that is not a breach. Also, if that information that you have in your systems is encrypted, and very important, don't keep the encryption key in the same place where you have your encrypted data. If all they got were ones and zeros and they can't read that your social security number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, then again, that is not a reportable breach. The one caveat I will tell you is that if you are subject to certain sectoral laws, meaning, for example, in the healthcare industry, if you're a healthcare provider or a billing processor subject to HIPAA, then even if there hasn't been a quote unquote breach, you probably still have reporting obligations. Similarly, depending upon what your contracts say, even if there hasn't been an actual breach of personally identifiable information, if confidential information of your customers has been compromised, you may still have a notice obligation, not to state law enforcement, but to customers. So you really do need to know what data you've got, what your obligations are statutorily, contractually, and otherwise in terms of what you're preparing for and what your obligations are if, God forbid, there is a breach and not, quote unquote, merely an incident. In terms of the dollars and cents that you could be looking at, the cost of the average data breach in the last 4 years has increased by more than 27%. That's a staggering increase in a short period of time. And for small business owners, that type of loss just isn't in your budget. So you really do need to think about preparing and being proactive, not merely being reactive. As far as who needs to be prepared, this is not just an IT issue. And I will tell you, I speak to so many different organizations. I do various webinars such as this one. I present to various audiences. And I always hear, particularly from the C-suite, the executives, oh, I've got an IT guy, not my job, not my issue. Well, here's the reality. It is your issue. And depending upon what statutes you are bound by, and I go back to the New York Shield Act and also the New York financial regulations, if you're subject to those, the C-suite is being held accountable. If you're the one that's signing the report to the New York State regulators that, yes, my business is in compliance, my business has taken reasonable measures to protect the personally identifiable information that we are storing. If that statement is a misrepresentation, you as the person that signed that statement is going to be held accountable, not just the IT guy. And remember, if your employee's data has been compromised, it's not just the IT guy who's going to be incurring the wrath of the personnel, and it's you that's going to be losing customers, not your IT guys. And if you're not engaged in the process, you better believe that your employees are not going to be engaged in the process. So you need to set the tone from the top down. As far as what needs to be protected, and again, we'll get into the specifics of the NIST framework here, but you need to think about, what do you have? And when I say what do you have, there's a number of different areas you need to think about this. So first of all, just for your businesses, what is your secret sauce? What makes your business unique? If you're in the software industry, do you have proprietary source code that you wouldn't want anybody else to have access to? You've got employee data. You may not want to know, or rather you may not want your employees inside your business or your competitors outside of your business what you're paying your people. You may not want people to know who's being let go. And if everybody has access to your systems and not just HR, people may know more than you may want them to know. Think about what you have vis-a-vis your customers. And again, even though the statutes are all focusing on protected health information and personally identifiable information, if you have non-disclosure agreements with your customers, as far as they're concerned, it's not just their personnel's data. It's also their secret sauce to the extent that you're holding that. You also need to consider who's processing your information. So if you've already moved to the cloud or are contemplating going to the cloud, who's touching that data and how is that going to be protected? All of these things you need to consider when you're figuring out, what am I protecting? Think about what your assets are. And again, I've already gone through this, but think about where your assets are as well. Now, what you'll hear sometimes, and I don't know how entrenched you are all in this space already, needless to say, this is my favorite soapbox. You may hear the phrase data mapping. Data mapping is basically the concept of following the electronic breadcrumbs and potentially the paper breadcrumbs, depending on how you're operating. So let's suppose that I go to see my doctor. The first thing happens when you visit your new doctor is you have to fill out a gazillion forms for them. Some doctors are now having you fill out the forms online, or they hand you a tablet when you first check in. So now your doctor has all this information about your health information, your history, whether you smoke, whether you drink, whether you're pregnant, whether you've gone through menopause. So, name your topic, your doctor now has that information. Now let's suppose the doctor has a billing agent. Now the billing agent is going to have information that I've had an office visit. My insurance company is X. My husband's insurance company may be Y. And now the billing company has that information. And let's suppose that it's a very small doctor's office. So they use a third party to come in and do other business functions for them. Do they have access to that data? The reason why data mapping is becoming more and more important is to the extent that you do have more states adopting legislation or contemplating legislation similar to the California Consumer Privacy Act, which talks about the right to be forgotten. So if you don't know where Michelle Schapp's patient information is, and now I decide to switch doctors, or I just decide I don't like doctors at all anymore, and I call up the doctor's office, who I just visited last week, and say, okay, now you need to forget me. If you don't know where all of those breadcrumbs are of the information you collected about me, how are you going to confirm that you've forgotten me? That's not to say you may not have obligations as a physician to maintain records for a period of time, but once that period of time is expired, you better be deleting my information. And consider this, If you have warranties that you give to your customers, and now your customer says, I want to be forgotten, one thing you may want to do is go back to your customer and say, I'll forget you, but that also means that you're losing your warranty. Are you sure you want to be forgotten, and therefore you will no longer have the protection of a warranty that you just purchased from me? So this can cut both ways, but if you don't know where the data is, you're not going to be able to comply with a request for a person to be forgotten, to transport that information to a new doctor, or to correct information. All of those things are hallmarks of the California Consumer Privacy Act. And some of you may have heard about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which may or may not impact your business currently. But again, don't assume that New Jersey's legislation, when it finally comes into play, will not include those types of protections. And given the fact that you're all on this webinar and businesses in New Jersey, this will apply to you. And don't just think about the electronic breadcrumbs, think about where you may have paper records as well. As far as what constitutes processing, and the reason why this matters is that you may not be the controller of information. And again, I don't know if you guys have heard these expressions of who is a controller, who is a processor, but the controller of data, when we're talking about personally identifiable information, is the entity or business or person who's decided, I want to collect information about Michelle Schapp, the patient. The processor is the person who I may be using to store that information for me if I've gone into the cloud. It may be my billing agent if I use a third-party billing agent. But by the way, a third-party billing agent could also become a controller if they use a third-party vendor to help them perform their functions for me. So you could be conceivably wearing the hat of both controller and processor. Those types of terminology are not yet in play in New Jersey's laws. They are in play in the California Consumer Privacy Act and also in the General Data Protection Regulation out of Europe. So I go back to what happens if you are not preparing. This is the fun part. 50 different states in the United States have 50 different breach notification laws. So let's suppose that you're not in New Jersey. Let's suppose that you're in one of those square states and you have employees and customers within the state in which you're housed, but then you also have employees and customers from the 5 states that surround your state. You now need to be aware of 5 different states' breach notification laws. And even sitting here in New Jersey, the odds are good that you have customers and employees that may not only be just in New Jersey, but also in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Connecticut, you fill in the blank. You need to know what those breach notification laws, and preferably know before the proverbial fill in the blank hits the fan, so that you can give timely notice and you know what's required. In addition to having breach notification laws, I already alluded to the fact that there is now proactive legislation coming down the pike, which requires businesses to take reasonable measures to secure data. Of course, reasonable is in the eye of the beholder, and different statutes and different sectoral laws define what is reasonable differently. So when you are done with this webinar, you need to understand which laws apply to your business, whether it's state laws, whether it's sectoral laws, or both, so that you need to know whether you're already bound by proactive legislation, as well as which breach notification laws will apply to you if, God forbid, you do have a breach. So let's assume that you've gotten the message already as part of this discussion, and you're realizing, I guess I better start doing something proactively. There are a whole bunch of different resources available already to small businesses like yourselves. NIST framework is one of them. And by the way, let me warn you that if you go online and you Google NIST, you could see an 800-page document that will make you nauseous. There are also NIST resources that are specifically designed for small and mid-sized businesses. They are much more user-friendly for a small business owner. They're much more concise, and their forms are much more helpful for the small business owner. For larger companies, you may see an ISO certification. ISO certification, and it's the 27001 series. Again, if you look at what those frameworks are, it's a lot to digest as a small business owner. What I often will tell my small business owner and solopreneurs is start with the CIS controls. And again, just Google CIS. You can Google SANS, S-A-N-S, and they have free resources available for small and mid-sized businesses. The CIS controls, and by the way, there are 20 CIS controls that are a good benchmark for a small business owner if you're not sure where to start in terms of putting into place reasonable measures. If you're accepting credit cards and you're storing credit card data, if you haven't already heard about Pci Compliance, and that's the payment card industry compliance, they have their own set of self-regulating standards. You should be in compliance with those. And understand that even if you're using a third party, whether it's PayPal or some other resource to process credit card information, if you're taking credit cards by telephone, there are specific procedures for you to write down that information, to put that information into the portal that you're putting it through to your payment processor. And I would strongly urge you not to keep that information on file. I know that's a convenience factor for you, for your customers, to make sure that you're getting paid, but I would be thinking twice right now whether you really want to keep that information. If you are keeping that information, that is that, let's suppose I'm one of your customers and I call you up and I say, I want to pay by credit card. Oh, and yes, please keep my credit card on file. If you're writing this down on paper, put it in the safe, lock the safe at night, make sure there's only a handful of people that have the combination to the safe. There is no reason that everybody in your business should have access to that information. You really don't want to tempt fate and have that information compromised. And again, I go back to the cleaning crew. It may not be your personnel. It could be somebody else who has come into your space and has stolen that information because you've left it out in paper where somebody can find it. That's not what you want to do. As far as the SANS Institute is concerned, and again, that's S-A-N-S, all capital letters, they actually have forms that you can download. The good and the bad of forms is that they are just that. You can't just print out the form and say, okay, this is my password policy. Okay, this is my clean desk policy. You have to make sure that that policy is something that you and your personnel can live with. The only thing that's worse than having a written policy, than not having a written policy, is enforcing it in the exception. So if you do use these resources and you start putting into place policies and procedures to take reasonable proactive measures to protect the personally identifiable information and protected health information that you are retaining, make sure that you're actually following what you've put into place. You don't want to have employees told, we want your passwords to now be 10 or more digits, and it should include capital letters, lowercase letters, numbers, exclamation point, what have you, but you're not policing it. And so instead, you've got the employee who's got their kid's soccer team as the password. And by the way, if you want to Google the original Anthem breach that hit so many people, that's exactly what happened, that one of the key executives used his kid's team as his password, and somebody cyber stalked him and found that, I don't recall whether it was on LinkedIn or Facebook. You want to make sure that you're guiding your personnel and yourself appropriately, that whatever you're using as your policies and procedures, they make sense, you're following them, and you're enforcing them. As far as the NIST framework is concerned, and by the way, whether you use the NIST framework, whether you use the CIS controls, the SANS resources, all of them have these key functions. Identify what your assets are. And again, when we say what your assets are, it's not just your assets, but what you're holding for your customers and what your vendors are holding for you. assess the threats and vulnerabilities and the risks to your business. Once you've identified those vulnerabilities and ranked them in terms of risk and impact on your business, then protect that data, mitigate where you choose to and where your budget allows for you to. Ideally, you're remediating things or mitigating the exposure. Then you want to be monitoring your systems to quickly, or as soon as possible, certainly detect intrusion. Remember that 9-year stat that I shared with you earlier in our discussion? You don't want to be that headline. Yes, small business owner in Essex County was compromised 5 years ago and only found out today because it was published in the Star Ledger. You want to detect as soon as possible, and then you want to respond to the intrusion that you've discovered and recover from it. I will tell you, when I go back to the beginning of our discussion of my small accounting practice, it's now, I believe, 2 years post-breach. I am happy to say he is still in business. He is wiser for it, and his systems are better secured. And this whole process of identifying, protecting, monitoring, detecting, responding, and recovering is an ongoing cycle. This is not a one and done. And in fact, the proactive legislation that's out there is saying that you should be doing this annually. Some frameworks say more frequently, depending upon the type of data that you're talking about. It may say quarterly. You also want to make sure what your contracts have required. What have you already signed up for with your customers? What have you represented to your customers that you are doing? And make sure that you're in fact doing it. Understanding what you're mitigating and remediating, again, you need to understand what the impacts are. Is it going to be loss of time? Is it going to be loss of information, loss of productivity, financial impact, credibility, identity theft? You need to know what's going to be impacted and what's the impact on your business. I mentioned earlier where your data is. It's really important to understand that where your data is not just your office. It's not just your file cabinets. It's not just your laptops. If you have employees that are receiving emails on their cell phones, it's there. If you have employees who are logging in from their personal computers at home, it's there. If you can put a USB drive into your workstation at your office, so can anybody else. One of the things that's on this slide that's noted here is an open external port. Now, at the risk of disclosing my age here, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was writing software license agreements for my clients, we wanted software vendors to remote in. We wanted software vendors to be able to fix a problem with the software and fix it quickly. If you are running legacy software and you had those types of license agreements in place, you may actually have open ports that you don't realize are still there. And I will share with you a lovely, again, this presentation would not be complete without war stories. Several years ago, there was a person out on the West Coast, I believe it was in Oregon, in bed early in the morning, minding his own business. He gets a phone call from a guy on the East Coast. Says, "Hello, my name is Mr. Smith. I don't want you to freak out, but you and your wife have a smart home and you haven't secured the system. You didn't change the password." The guy out on the West Coast is scratching his head and saying, "Who are you? What kind of a crackpot are you? And am I going to call the police now or later?" Our friend on the East Coast said, "I really don't want to upset you. I'm not trying to freak you out, but I'm going to turn the lights on and off in your bedroom so you can see what I'm talking about." And our guy on the East Coast, in fact, turned the lights on and off in the West Coast bedroom, whereupon our friend on the West Coast sat up bolt right in bed and said, "You've got my attention." They hadn't changed the password that was publicly available online for the smart home. Remember, I started our discussion about making sure that your employees that are remoting in have changed the default passwords on their routers. If you haven't changed default passwords on company systems or employee systems where they're now touching your data, that's problematic. And think about this scenario. Let's suppose that for your marketing, you have now purchased USB drives with a CSG logo, an SBDC logo, fill in the blank, your brand logo. Several years ago, the ADA, the American Dental Association, had a conference. Part of the announcement to the dentists in attendance was, oh, by the way, the codes for insurance have changed. Of course, all the dentists are now groaning. I just trained my staff on what the codes are for root canal. We now have to retrain them. And the ADA said, don't worry, in your packets from this conference are USB drives with the new codes. Life is good, don't worry. So all the little dentists go back to their offices, and the first dentist hands the USB drive to his office administrator and said, here, upload the new codes. 5 minutes later, that same dentist called the ADA and said, what did you do to me? The ADA had sourced the USB drives from China, and they came preloaded with malware. So when you think about USB drives and all those conferences that you may be going to and people giving you free USB drives, I wouldn't use them. And if you've got them in your desk right now, think about throwing them away. And if you get them as promotional items that you want to use to promote your brand, make sure you know where those USB drives have been sourced and what's on them. The other way that businesses are being compromised is the helpful employee. So consider this. I'm walking into work today and I see in our parking lot a CSG branded USB drive. And they, oh, somebody must have lost their USB drive. I wonder whose it is and what information they're missing. I will be a helpful worker bee and plug it into my desktop and make sure whose it is and get it back to them. If in fact that was planted by a bad actor who printed up CSG logos, slapped it onto USB drives that they preloaded with malware, I've just helped somebody compromise my firm's systems. That's how easy these things are happening. So again, think about not allowing people to put USB drives into their systems. You can block those USB drives. And what I would suggest is that if you have customers who want to share information with you on a USB drive, have a standalone computer on which you can download the data, make sure there isn't malware on the information, and then bring it into your systems. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to take a quick sip of my tea because I've been doing a lot of talking and my throat's getting dry. I'll be back in a moment. Thank you for your patience. I'm now back. I've alluded to what is reasonable. Rome wasn't built in a day, but there was a plan. And if you have regulators coming into your offices, and if you have customers asking you, what is your plan? What is your framework? You don't have to break the bank in one fell swoop. You don't have to cure everything tomorrow. But what you do need to do is understand and assess where your vulnerabilities are, where your risks are, and then put together a budget and a timeline. Okay, so I've determined that we don't have a password policy. I've determined that we don't have multi-factor authentication. I've determined that we haven't encrypted our data. Our file cabinets don't get locked at night. The doors to our offices aren't locked before 7 o'clock at night. Right? Go down the list and identify what those risks are and rate them. What's going to be a high impact to my business? What's a medium impact to my business? What's a low impact? And what is a quick fix? I go back to passwords as an example. It's pretty easy to change a password policy to tell personnel 6-digit password's not going to cut it anymore. You need to have at least a 10-digit password. Your personnel are going to groan, tell them to get over it. That's an easy, cost-effective fix. What may not be as easy and cost-effective a fix is to adopt encryption. There are different encryption solutions depending upon who your provider is. I would at a minimum ask the question, what's available? But as I said, you don't have to fix everything at once. What you do want to have is written documentation that you've assessed those risks. You've identified an action plan. I'm going to fix these vulnerabilities, these risks in Q1. I'm going to address these things in Q2, and so on. Have that written out, have it documented, because your customers are not going to expect you to fix everything at once. They want to know you have a plan. Same thing with the regulators. You don't have to cure everything at once, but you do want to be able to show them that you're being proactive, you're being reasonable. To the extent that you're considering banking online, or if you're already banking online, think about having a standalone computer that's only used for banking. These types of things are relatively easy, effective fixes, but make sure that you document what you've identified as a vulnerability, how you've rated that vulnerability and the impact on your system and your business, and then have a plan to resolve those vulnerabilities. Of course, just as with written policies and procedures, the only thing worse than not having a plan is not following it. And that's not to say that things might not interrupt the budgetary plan. If that happens, if you're supposed to be fixing a vulnerability in, say, September, but because cash flow has changed because of the coronavirus, and it needs to now slide to December or Q1 in 2021, that may happen. But document that that's happened, why you've made that business decision, and act reasonably and appropriately in recording that and planning for it. As far as the response, I can tell you right now, putting your head in the sand is not going to cut the mustard. And saying I'm not a target or I don't have useful information, I go back to my 4-person accounting practice. It never occurred to him as a small business owner with a handful of clients that he was going to be a target. The problem is that when you have a weak VPN, you don't have strong protection in place, you don't have encryption, somebody's not breaking into your system having targeted your system. They've stumbled upon your system because you have an exposed vulnerability. You have a default password that hasn't been changed and somebody's gotten in there. When we looked at the forensics from my small accountant, what we saw was the original compromise going back to November was one guy located in the Ukraine that was on his part-time employee's systems for 10 minutes. If you looked at the electronic paper trail, if you will, from November until March, when the breach was confirmed, visitors to the site and to the environment varied from Ukraine, Russia, China, Korea, Florida, Texas, fill in your favorite location, and the dwell time, meaning how long was somebody in the system, varied from 2 minutes to 4 hours. You need to realize if you have a presence online, by definition, you're a potential target. Remember the quote we started with. It's not if, it's when, and you may not know it yet. So in terms of how you respond to risk, you could certainly avoid it and say, you know what? I appreciate Bayer Pharmaceutical, Bristol Myers, that you're offering to retain me as a vendor, but I can't afford to agree to the policies and procedures that you want me to sign on to. That's okay. You could choose not to accept that risk from a customer who is asking you to assume unlimited liability. To the extent that you've identified risk and you can mitigate it or reduce it, again, changing password policies, putting in 2-factor authentication, great. Eliminating the risk by closing open ports, by not allowing people to put in USB drives, these are all acceptable and appropriate responses to risk. In terms of shifting or sharing the risk, you could do that by going to a cloud provider. You could do that by bringing on a vendor. You could do that by purchasing cyber insurance and crime coverage. And we'll get into that later on in this discussion. or you could accept the risk. And if it's a low risk to your business, that may be an appropriate response. But the fact is, you need to make a decision. Once you've identified the risk, how are you going to respond to it? How are you going to mitigate or remediate it? Or are you going to accept it? As far as how you mitigate or remediate, there are some basics. Antivirus software, firewalls, we've talked about passwords, we talked about two-factor authentication. Let's break these down a little bit. Antivirus software is terrific. However, it's only terrific for known viruses. You may have heard the phrase 0 day. That is the first time that a virus or a piece of malware is seen in the wild, as it were. Nobody knows what it is yet, and nobody knows how to stop it yet. So antivirus software is not going to protect you from that. Firewalls are very important, but they need to be configured properly. And if you're not sure if your firewalls are configured properly, have somebody come in and kick the tires. We've talked about passwords. It's like your underwear. You want to change it periodically. You may not need to change it as frequently as your underwear, but depending upon how long the passwords are that your personnel are using, you may have to change them more frequently. If you're only mandating 8-digit passwords, you should be changing them pretty often. I would suggest instead at a minimum 10-digit passwords. And by the way, please don't assume digits means numbers. Again, it should be a combination of letters, numbers, symbols, and ones that are not used for multiple accounts. And at a minimum, you want to see people changing those quarterly, every 6 months. If you want to go crazy and have it be a 16-digit password, God bless, you only have to change it annually. But trust me, your personnel will be cursing you out if you mandate 16-digit passwords. As far as multi-factor authentication, some of you may have heard about that and not know what it is. I will tell you, the idea is that it's something you have and something you know. So when I log into my work systems, I put in my username, I put in my password, I put in a 4-digit PIN, and then I have a revolving code that changes every minute. So when I log in, I have to put in all of those things. I know my password, I have my 4-digit PIN, and the code changes. There are different ways that you can implement two-factor or multi-factor authentication, but think about, again, what's touching your systems. If it's not just company-issued devices, if your employees can log in from personal devices, you want to make sure that these measures, whether it's passwords, multi-factor authentication, is employed on anything that's touching your systems. By the way, I want to digress for a minute, talking about where data is. If you have leased equipment, if you're leasing copy machines, if you're leasing computers, those devices store information. When you return them off of lease, you can't count on the vendor wiping that data for you. So unless it's part of your contract, you're responsible for wiping that data. There was a guy up in Canada who unfortunately his business went bankrupt. And to make some extra money, he sold servers on eBay. However, he never wiped the data from those servers before he sold them. You can imagine what was released onto the internet from those servers, available for anybody and everybody. So if you have leased equipment, that should be thought about as well when you're thinking about mitigation and protection of information. As far as encryption is concerned, and I know there's a lot of folks dialed in today in the banking industry, the buzzword for you guys these days is not necessarily encryption, but tokenization, meaning not just that the information is being encrypted, but it's now being instead identified as a hash or a token. I don't want to go too far in the weeds here because I know that not everybody's in the banking or the financial industry. And certainly feel free to reach out to me offline if you want to have a further discussion as to what tokenization is. But as far as encryption is concerned, the original level encryption that people were thinking about was 128-bit encryption. That's now referred to as pretty good. And I'm not kidding. That's the phrase that's used for it. There's now an ad campaign out there, and I don't even remember what product it's for, which maybe means it's not too effective an ad campaign, but the tagline is pretty good isn't good enough. Pretty good encryption probably isn't good enough when you're talking about personally identifiable information or protected health information. So if you're going to adopt encryption and have vendors adopt encryption, right now you want to see 256-bit encryption. Some industries are now looking at 512-bit encryption. That's not the standard these days in most industries, but just to be aware it's out there. The other thing is, I don't know if anybody's dialed in who's part of the defense industry. And when I say the defense industry, so let's suppose that you're in the aerospace industry and you provide parts or systems to the aerospace industry. I will tell you right now, there are new standards. And when I say new, they were actually adopted over a year ago. And the defense industry is going to be auditing this year. So if you haven't put into place multi-factor authentication, if you don't have passwords defined for your personnel, firewalls, antivirus software, and so on and so forth, do it now. As far as upgrading and patches, I am sure you guys have seen alerts from your various software companies and vendors that are all saying there's a new upgrade available. It may be on your iPhone, it may be on your Samsung, fill in the blank what system it is. And what you're seeing is upgrades are available. For the most part, I can tell you those are polite euphemisms for patches, which means that the vendor or the provider has found a vulnerability in this system and they want to patch it as soon as possible so that you're not experiencing a compromise because of a weakness in their systems or their services. The problem is that if you get an alert about a patch, my guess is your instinct is, especially if you're in the middle of working, you're hitting remind me later. Remind me later, remind me later, remind me later. Here's the issue. The bad actors know there's a vulnerability out there, and the window of opportunity to compromise that vulnerability is going to close because eventually you're going to stop hitting remind me later. So the bad actors are hitting those weaknesses really hard when patches are being released. Don't hit remind me later. Tell your personnel that they should first confirm that the patches are in fact from Microsoft. They're in fact from Apple, and then apply those patches sooner rather than later. For small businesses, applying patches are easier than large businesses because if you think about it, if you've got multi-sites, you're now having to coordinate those patches and how they're applied across many systems, many offices, and many devices. But assuming that you're a relatively small business operation, these should not be challenges to be applying these patches. If you're using Microsoft systems, I will tell you that Microsoft has Patch Tuesday. So if you're not already getting alerts from Microsoft, go into Microsoft systems to look for what patches and alerts they've put out on a Tuesday. That's their cycle. If there's a God forbid in a Microsoft system, they'll patch otherwise, but typically they're patching their systems on Tuesday. As I mentioned already, antivirus solutions are not going to protect you from everything. The other problem, of course, is that viruses, just like colds and flu strains, morph. So don't assume that your antivirus software is going to protect you from everything. Other means of mitigating and remediating are making sure that your systems time out. So I had done a cybersecurity awareness program for a law firm out in the Lehigh Valley several years ago. They had 30 to 35 professionals plus an additional 20 in staff. As I was talking to them, I said, okay, so you guys are out in the Lehigh Valley, beautiful area, fairly remote. I said, let me guess, by 6 o'clock, this place is a ghost town. They said, yeah, that's pretty much right. I said, okay, and what time does the cleaning crew come in? And they said, around 5:36. I said, and how long do your computers stay live before they time out? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you get up to go to the restroom and then you go get lunch and a cup of coffee, you come back and your screensaver's on. This particular firm had their system set to not time out for 2 hours. So I gave them this scenario. I'm busy working at my desk It's 5:30. I look at my watch and I say, oh my God, I'm late for a client lunch. I'm sorry, a client dinner. I said 5:30. I leave. I don't log out. Now it's 6:30. The office is a ghost town, but my computer is still live. And the poor cleaning crew, and I apologize if anybody on this call is from that industry and has cleaning crews. I don't mean to make you out as bad guys, but somebody could come in with their cell phone and take a picture of whatever was left on my desk. They could pop in a USB drive if those are still available on my workstation. You don't want to have your computers set to timeout for 2 hours. If you have sensitive information, if you're in accounting practice, have a clean desk policy. Physical security. If you've got an office like ours, we have over 160 professionals, not to mention over 100 support staff. I'd like to say that I know everybody on my office face, but somebody could be a new hire. I may have no idea who they are. If I see them walking into the office after hours, am I going to be polite and hold the door for them without asking to see ID? The problem is that our instinct is yes, to be polite. And what you want to train your personnel to be is helpful and polite, but verifying. Don't just hold the door for somebody who doesn't belong there. Don't just allow somebody to come up to your workstation and say, hi, I have a Microsoft shirt, symbol on my shirt. So therefore, I must be from Microsoft. And I understand you're having a problem with your computer. Go get a cup of coffee and I'll take care of it. That scenario sounds far-fetched, but that's how larger companies are being compromised. Somebody's at their workstation, they don't know that somebody didn't call IT, and they're allowing somebody to have access to their systems because they think there's something wrong just because the person who came to visit them in their desk is wearing a Microsoft shirt. Training personnel is still the #1 most cost-effective way for small business owners to avoid a disaster. Training can be done as a lunch and learn. It can be done as a breakfast and learn. If you would like me to come in and train your staff, feed me. I like to eat. I will come in and I will train your staff over breakfast. I will train your staff over lunch. It's something that is so critical. Several months ago, I received an email from another law firm, partner at the firm who I didn't know. Needless to say, I've been trained. I am a trainer. I am professionally paranoid. The email was from a partner at the firm that I didn't know. And the email said, please see this proposal and then call me. Again, I'm professionally paranoid. So I did not respond to that email and I didn't click on the link. Instead, I went online, I Googled the law firm, found the true email for this employee, sent him an email and said, did you send me a proposal? Please advise. Again, being professionally paranoid, I didn't stop there. I also called him at his office using the phone number on the website, not the phone number in the email, and left him a voicemail message. Hi, this is Michelle Schaff. I'm at CSG. Did you send me a proposal? I got an email back responding to my email. And remember, I sent the email to the known email, the correct email for the law firm. And in response to that email came back, yes, I sent you this proposal. I look forward to speaking with you. If I were not properly trained, the odds are good I would have clicked on the link. Instead, I waited for a call back. 2 hours later, the partner in that other firm in New Jersey called me back and said, thank you so much for calling me. Somebody breached our systems and put in a rule that was redirecting my email. So even though I had sent the confirming email to the known email address for this particular partner, somebody was intercepting that. So even if I didn't click on the link to the proposal, which was in fact a link to malware in the first instance, somebody who hadn't been properly trained probably would have clicked the link in the responding email. If in doubt, you should be picking up the phone and verifying. Understand also that artificial intelligence is now mimicking people's voices. So it's not just you getting a phone call from the boss, but you then calling the boss back at the known phone number to verify. A few months ago, there was a CEO who had gone to, I believe it was Tokyo, on business. A bad actor had gotten into the company's systems several months previously and was doing their homework. They were looking at speech patterns. They were looking at travel patterns and knew that this CEO was traveling on business for a proposed business deal, knew who the admin was for this CEO. Time difference between New Jersey and Tokyo with daylight savings time is 13 hours. While the CEO was over in Tokyo, somebody got into the system, left a voicemail message using artificial intelligence for the admin saying, "Hi, it's Joe. It's been a long day, but I'm really excited. The deal's moving forward. Please arrange for wire of the deposit. Here's the wire instructions," and sent a confirming email also with the wire instructions. It was now 1 o'clock in the morning Tokyo time. The admin knew Joe was going to be tired, didn't want to bother him, and went ahead and executed on the request to wire funds. It wasn't Joe. His email had been compromised and his voice had been copied using artificial intelligence. So when I say pick up the phone and verify, if you get a message electronically by email, by voicemail, any way that somebody says wire funds, call the known phone number for the person who's making the request and wait for the response. Think about what almost happened to my firm had I not been as paranoid and as trained as I was. This is one of my favorite cartoons, but the reality is this is not a cybersecurity training program. You need to educate your personnel. You need to educate them at least annually, ideally more often. 61% of respondents reported that it was negligent employees that put their company at risk for a ransomware attack. And understand, we're not talking about malicious employees. We're talking about employees that were not properly trained. I share this example because my name lends itself to being spoofed. If you're not wearing reading glasses, and I need reading glasses to read a screen, the L in my name, or should I say one of my L's, could easily be changed to a capital I. It could be changed to a 1. It could be changed to any of a number of things. And if these emails were looked at while somebody was stopped at a traffic light instead of sitting at a desk with a large screen, it's all too easy for them to assume the email was from Michelle and not from a malicious actor. And of course, it could be that somebody's in fact in my system and just redirecting my actual email address. Links can be checked if you hover your mouse over them. So what it might display as is just an email from Michelle Schaff. It might not show mschaff@csglaw.com. Hover your mouse over the link and you'll see what in fact the email is from. If you're not sure, pick up the phone. Again, no webinar would be complete without a little bit of entertainment. You want to make sure you've trained your personnel. Cloud is not a dirty word. I will tell you, a lot of my small to mid-sized clients say, I can't go to the cloud. I mean, I won't know where my data is. But here's the reality. Assuming that you're going to an AWS, to a Microsoft solution, what have you, they've invested a lot more money in security than is probably in your budget. What you do want to do is ask the potential cloud provider, what do you have available for me? What solutions do you have? What will it cost for me to be in a private cloud instead of a public cloud? Where are your systems backed up? Are they backed up in New Jersey and California or not? And by the way, are you exporting my data outside the United States, which may or may not be permitted depending upon what industry you're in? Also ask for certifications from a potential provider, whether it's PCI compliance if they're processing credit card information for you. You may want to ask for SOC reports. However, take SOC reports with a grain of salt. And the reason I say that is that SOC reports are subject to how the company has scoped out the audit. So if the company that provides to you the SOC report limits the scope, you're only going to see a snapshot or an audit report on what they have had audited. As far as shifting risk to insurance, I will tell you right now that unlike more mature insurance products like personal injury, general commercial liability, cybersecurity insurance and crime coverage is still a wild frontier. Worse yet, a lot of insurance brokers really aren't familiar with these products. So you may say to your insurance agent, I've got cyber insurance, right? And they say, yeah, you're covered, no sweat. Well, my poor little 4-person accounting practice had a $50,000 slap onto his otherwise E&O policy, $50,000 cyber insurance with a $25,000 deductible. Needless to say, that was useless and was used up in very short order. You want to understand if you're purchasing cyber insurance or crime coverage, what is it covering? Is it covering first-party claims? Is it covering third-party claims? Is it going to cover the cost of forensic? Is it going to cover your attorney's fees? Is it going to cover the cost for credit monitoring services if you have to provide those to the people who've been compromised? Is it going to cover bricking, meaning that you have to replace computers because they've become literally bricks? Is it going to cover ransom payments? You need to understand what's being covered. I'm going to pause because I see that somebody's not being able to hear me, and I'm not quite sure why that's the case. Priscilla, are you online and can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so apparently at least one person can hear me. It may be on their end then. So thank you for confirming, Priscilla. Whoever can't hear, certainly to the extent that you're not hearing me further, and this is silly, I'm speaking to you as if you can hear me. Reach out to Priscilla, and Priscilla, if you can email this particular attendee and let them know they could follow up with me or with you afterwards.
No problem.
Thank you. Again, understand what your insurance is covering. As far as the other types of things to consider with cyber insurance versus crime coverage, they're not the same thing. What crime coverage will step in for is if funds are wired inappropriately. But again, not all crime coverage will cover that type of exposure depending upon how funds were wired. And I go back to the admin who thought that she was wiring funds at the instruction of the CEO. That might not be covered by your crime coverage because nobody actually got into your system and redirected funds. As far as cyber insurance, again, you want to know the devil in the details. What are the dollars and cents deductibles, but there's also time deductibles when it comes to cyber insurance. I see here we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to try to go through the rest of these slides relatively quickly. Again, make sure that you've got an insurance agent who's knowledgeable. If they glaze over when you ask them this checklist of questions, find another insurance agent. If they are knowledgeable, make sure they're providing you the right policy. And when you think about in New Jersey, Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Irene, the business interruption insurance that will protect you from that type of event is not the same type of insurance that will protect you from business interruption from a cyber event. So ask these questions and make sure you're getting answers that you're happy with. I'm not going to dwell on these other issues with regard to cyber insurance only because I know we're running out of time. These are fairly detailed slides here, but please feel free to follow up with me with your free consulting sessions offered by the Small Business Development Corporation by email. I'm happy to answer your questions with regard to insurance. Monitoring your systems is critical. And I go back to the Target example. When the HVAC venter was compromised, and by the way, that's how the Target breach happened, there were alerts going off in Target's systems. Had anybody been looking at the logs, they would have known, but the logs weren't being monitored. And again, this goes back to there's nothing worse than having a lack of policies and procedures than enforcing those It's great if somebody's monitoring your systems, but if nobody's looking at the logs, they're useless. So monitor the systems to see what's happening. Vet those vendors. I alluded to cloud providers. Again, I apologize for anybody who's in the cleaning industry. Know who you're entrusting your data with and what you've imposed upon them contractually and what their practices are. Have your data backed up and test the backups. If you have a backup server that's adjacent to your primary server, that's not a secure backup. And assuming that you have cloud backups and server backups, test those periodically to make sure you can bring your systems back up onto clean servers and understand how long it will take you to do that. You must have an incident response plan. Even if it's to call Michelle Schapp or to call Priscilla or to call your insurance provider, have a written plan. And by the way, having the plan on your computer is not the answer, because if you've been hit by ransomware, you're not going to be able to access that plan. Have it written out, have it in multiple locations. So the other thing to think about is who needs to have that information. Everybody in my office has an index card that's a little cheat sheet. Think about, for those of you who ever saw the movie Practical Magic, or somebody who's as old as I am, the old PTA calling tree, you used to get alerted about snow days from a PTA calling tree. If your systems are down, if somebody loses a cell phone, if somebody's clicked on a link while they're on vacation, while God forbid they're on a cruise, if they're any place, they need to have a written piece of paper, a little cheat sheet that knows who they are supposed to call. Test the plan, make sure it's doing what you need it to do. Priscilla, I can keep going for another half hour, but I think we're getting close to time. So you tell me if we should keep going or I should catch my breath.
Yes, we are at 2:30. The next webinar will be starting at 3. But I think we can take, 5 minutes or so if anyone has any questions.
We have a question here, which I will read to everybody, which is, what are the best practices for PCI compliance regarding what type of network setup you should have and what type of firewall to use, and how often you should monitor what is going on in and out of the firewall? Are there any products that you would recommend? That was a mouthful. The answer to this question is it will depend. It will depend on what industry you're in. It will also depend on what type of resources you have. In the first instance, what I would do is print out the information that's available from the payment card industry site itself. And it lists out what those practices are as to what is quote unquote reasonable and accepted industry standard. I am generally vendor and solution agnostic. So I don't like to say use X product or Y product. What I can do is suggest some vendors for you that do this type of assessment that are also industry agnostic. And if you email me directly, I'll share with you those resources and they can make some recommendations as to which products you might want to enlist to do this. And in terms of how your firewall should be configured, again, keeping in mind that I'm not a technology person, I am the person who can share with you what you need to do. You want to have your guy or your outside resource to look at your firewall and make sure it's appropriately configured. Our next question here is, I'm concerned about keeping my cell phone safe. Any advice? And the same for a website. I've seen others try to gain administrative access from Russia, Ukraine. How do I get a report and check on it? And by the way, going back to monitoring systems, I will tell you that we have in our environment here at the firm programs installed that monitor our environment. We are also a larger organization, so we have internal resources that are monitoring our logs to detect what's going on. For a smaller business, like a lot of folks on this phone call, in this webinar, You can hire outside resources to monitor your systems, to detect intrusions, and to give you alerts. You need to vet those vendors. One of my clients indeed engaged with one of these vendors to monitor their systems. They found out they were compromised when one of their vendors called them. They were not alerted by the company that was supposed to be on monitoring their systems. So not all third-party resources are created equal. Again, I'm more than happy to share with you some resources that you may want to look to. I don't like to advertise one particular vendor over another. In terms of your website and people trying to compromise your website, what you want to do is check to see what your administrative protocols are for your website. Are they default passwords or have those been changed? What type of portals do you have into your system? And consider whether in fact you've secured all the different permutations of your domain names. Again, you want to have third-party resources if you don't have them internally to monitoring what's going on your sites and what's going on internally. And as far as your cell phone is concerned, again, I would encourage you to have multi-factor authentication in place, and I would contact your provider, whether you're using a Samsung, whether you're using an iPhone, what have you. Ask them what resources are available and what you should be putting into place. As far as our next question, and I do apologize, it is indeed a cleaning business. So I'm so sorry that I hung you out to dry in this call, and I'm sure you're wonderful. Now, in terms of using Square for transactions, and I apologize, you're not going to like my answer. If you read the fine print or not so fine print, even though Square itself is PCI compliant, they will not indemnify you and hold you harmless. So if God forbid Square is compromised, you're on your own. So I would go back and look to see what your cyber insurance coverage is. Square has revolutionized small businesses, but they will not defend you. I will tell you that I represent a large franchise system, and we negotiated for both company-owned and franchise locations an agreement with Square where, in fact, Square accepted some liability and some skin in the game, but that's because it was a multinational franchise system that Square wanted their business. Unfortunately, small business owners do not have those resources. Square is PCI compliant, but they're not going to stand behind you. As far as using your cell phone to accept credit card transactions, I would again reach out to Square, ask them if they have recommendations as to how you configure your device, as to how you're interacting with Square, and follow those recommendations. Take advantage of resources that are available. Pick up the phone, call your banks, and ask them, how can I better secure my accounts? And then enlist those practices. There are a lot of resources out there from your current vendors if you make those inquiries. While we're waiting to see if we have other questions, I'm going to quickly flip down in my slide deck because I alluded to you earlier some free resources. So let me just scroll down here, and I apologize. I'm not going to try to go too quickly because I don't want to make anybody nauseous. Okay, so I had mentioned before NJKIC. NJKIC is the New Jersey Cybersecurity Communication Integration Cell. They are a wonderful resource. Please, when we are done with this call, enroll in the KIC. Go online, it's www, and in fact, I think I've got the website, it's hidden by my chat screen. But if you can't find it on my slides, you'll be able to find it online. The KIC puts out alerts weekly, so you'll know what the latest and greatest is of what's going on in New Jersey. They also, from time to time, will also offer free webinars where you can get more information similar to this webinar. IC3 is the FBI's website. They also put out alerts. We already talked about the NIST framework and ISO. There are also public-private partnerships where you can get additional resources. InfraGard is a terrific one. The only caveat with InfraGard is that you have to be cleared by the FBI because it's a public-private partnership with the FBI. So if indeed you register to join InfraGard now, if you don't already have security clearance at the level they require, it may take 6 months for you to become a member of InfraGard. There are also now FBI and Homeland Security Citizens Academies. I'm actually going through the Homeland Security Academy currently. First of all, I will warn you, to a certain degree, it is a public service announcement / community outreach, because the fact is the FBI and Homeland Security wants you to know, yeah, we are really here to help. We're not just saying that, but it's also an eye-opening education on what's available in the dark web. You'll also get to meet local law enforcement officials before the proverbial fill in the blank has hit the fan. This last website, the CISA site, again, is a great resource. It's for free to let you know what's going on. What you want to do is improve your resiliency, whether it's through training personnel, whether it's assessing your systems, putting into place, monitoring, having a plan, knowing how to respond, doing tabletop exercises. And by the way, if you go to get cyber insurance, a lot of insurance companies are now offering free resources. It's enlightened self-interest. They don't want to have to pay out on a policy. They'd rather help educate you for the cost of your premium. So if you go to buy cyber insurance tomorrow or next week, ask if your carrier is offering those resources. So in summary, before Priscilla's next webinar starts, be prepared, identify your assets and where they're exposed, manage, mitigate, remediate, detect as soon as possible, respond, recover, and repeat. Your businesses hopefully are not static. They're growing, and your response plans should not be static either. If you have further questions, if you want to get copies of these slides, this is how to get the information. I hope you found this webinar useful. Thank you so much. Have a good day, and please stay paranoid and healthy.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle, for a great webinar. For those who are in attendance, you will receive a copy of today's presentation in your email. So please just give us a few hours and we'll get that to you at the end of today. Is there any other questions before we close out? All right, great. Thanks again for attending. Michelle, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to give us a great webinar. And I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a great day. Goodbye.